Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Lindsay Craig. I'm president of National Review Institute, and we are just thrilled to be here in North Carolina today, right from my home in Westchester, New York. It's really been an amazing opportunity during this rather historic period for all of us to be able to be together. And so I'm really awfully grateful for this technology so that we can be with all of you. We are partnering here today, as you all know, with the John Locke Foundation as well as Civitas. And I'm just really, again, so grateful that we're able to do these partnerships. As many of you know, we do events around the country, National Review Institute does, and we do it because we want to be able to see, in this case virtually, all of our supporters, whether they're readers of National Review or supporters of National Review Institute. And we are really pleased here to see so many of you are interested in the world of ideas, right? We like to partner with groups around the country because frankly, it's in our DNA. As many of you know, our founder, Bill Buckley, had a really special ability to bring people together. The movement that he founded, which then has blossomed into having these many groups, like John Locke and the Civitas Fund, really was a rich and diverse group. It represented a very wide spectrum of the right, from the traditionalists to the free market libertarians. And over the years, National Review, the publication, has also represented and promoted, both in theory and in practice, this kind of fusionism. Multiple views appearing on the pages of National Review. And so for the Institute, we want to practice this kind of fusionism too. We want to be able to bring together those of us who have much more in common than we do not, and to defend and advance our shared principles of a free and prosperous society. This is an absolutely vital component of the NR mission, and it's one that was the same yesterday, today, and it will be tomorrow as well. So we look forward to growing our movement. As we work together, our movement becomes stronger. And I think in these important times when we need to shout from the mountaintops about our principles, working together is the best way that we can expand the group of people that can have access to our ideas. And so, well, of course, you're familiar with National Review. You might not be as familiar with National Review Institute, so just a moment on that. We're the nonprofit organization established to support the mission of the magazine. And our core objective at NRI is to preserve and promote the legacy of Bill Buckley. We advocate for free speech, religious liberty, defense of Western civilization, rule of law, as you'll talk about here today, a strong national defense, and limited government, because we believe that this provides the best opportunity for human flourishing. So I just want to say again, thank you to all of you for joining us here today. Thank you to our two co-sponsored groups for participating. And if any of you are in North Carolina and are interested in getting in touch with us, those of you who are 1955 Society members on our call will know Francisco Gonzalez. He is our director of philanthropy. He's based out of Florida, but he covers the entire Southeast. So next time we do an event in person, you'll be able to meet with him. But if any of you are interested in getting in touch with him, we'll be able to send you his contact information. So anyway, you're in for a treat today to hear from Andy McCarthy, one of NRI's star fellows. And allow me to just turn this over to Donna at the John Locke Foundation to move forward with the introductions.
Lindsay, thank you so much. We are so excited about this collaboration today between National Review Institute and our friends just down the road, the Civitas Institute. So welcome to North Carolina's freedom movement, because the folks who are on this virtual chat today, this virtual call, really do represent people who understand the need for organizations like National Review Institute, John Locke Foundation, and Civitas Institute. They really do understand that this is vital that we have their support. So to all of you who are guests today, thank you so much, not only for joining us today, but for being supporters of freedom of liberty, and all of the different work that these three organizations do in order to make sure that we continue to be a free society. So I'm very, very honored to be the host today. And to our guests who are along for this conversation, please do remember there is going to be a portion for Q&A after we have a little bit of our conversation with our incredible panelists today. So if you want to ask a question, just type it into the chat box. And when we get to the Q&A, we're going to cover some of those questions. Our first panelist today actually is my boss, and so it's my treat to introduce her. She is Amy Cooke. She is the CEO of the John Locke Foundation. She is also the publisher of Carolina Journal, which is our journalism division here at the John Locke Foundation. Amy came to us in January after she spent more than a dozen years in Colorado's freedom movement with the Independence Institute. So Amy, you have written and you tell people all the time that you're a newbie to North Carolina, but there is nowhere else you would rather be. Explain why.
Donna, thank you. And thank you to the National Review Institute and of course to our friends at Civitas for making all of this possible today. Absolutely thrilled to be with everybody. Yeah, you know, to your point, Donna, about there is no place else I'd rather be. And it goes back to the founding of the John Locke Foundation, which was 30 years ago. So the John Locke Foundation is celebrating 30 years, looking forward to our next decade, our next 30 years, but founded on those principles of limited constitutional government, free markets, much like Bill Buckley, you know, that Lindsay mentioned earlier. And we were one of those think tanks that really came out of that late 80s, early 90s movement. We've been doing it for that long. And when I say there's no place I'd rather be, I have to say, I usually preface it with, I wouldn't have scripted it this way. I wouldn't have picked a pandemic. I don't think I would have picked mob violence, destruction of private property, all of the things that we see going on right now. But even though I wouldn't have scripted it that way, that is where we are. And there is no time that I have seen in my tenure in this movement where I've seen, we aren't just having policy debates, Donna, we are having our principles attacked. Freedom is being undermined with a sort of a Marxist ideology. And so, yeah, for people like me who have dedicated our professional lives to celebrating freedom, there is no place I'd rather be. And with the staff here at the Locke Foundation, where you know, we promote free markets, free minds, limited constitutional government through groundbreaking research. You mentioned Carolina Journal. That's our investigative journalism arm. You know, through our Headlock podcast, through social media, through blogs, through a whole number of things. And with, you know, people often ask, where does the rubber meet the road? If you write a white paper, so what? Well, in North Carolina, all you have to do is look at pre-COVID, that decade of an economic renaissance that North Carolina was enjoying, where we were at the top of many of the business and economic freedom indexes. We were at the top. And much of that is due in part to the research and the policies that were advocated by organizations like the John Locke Foundation, of course, our friends over at the Civitas Institute. You know, lawmakers don't just walk in and go, hey, I got an idea. We provide roadmaps for them. We provide the research for them. We provide them with the foundation they need to make wise public policy choices. And North Carolina was a case study for what happens when a state implements free market public policy and allows individuals more freedom, more choice in their own lives, keep more of your own money, decide where your kids go to school, all of that. And then unfortunately we had the pandemic and now our principles are under attack, but you're right, I would want to be anywhere else. So thank you for that introduction.
And one of the folks who has actually been an up close and personal witness to that decade of economic renaissance that Amy just mentioned is our good friend Donald Bryson. Donald is the president and chief executive officer of the Civitas Institute. And before he took the lead at Civitas, Donald was actually state director for Americans for Prosperity North Carolina. And so that organization, in addition to the John Locke Foundation, was instrumental in that decade of renaissance. Donald, so glad you were along today. Tell us about everything you've seen in North Carolina.
North Carolina's seen, to Amy's point, an amazing decade. And if you'd like to read more about that, actually, the Civitas Institute has started a project this year to talk about that decade of success and how the next decade could possibly be a decade of success, called A Better Carolina. You can check that out at abettercarolina.com. I think Amy hit the nail on the head that we have been sort of the test case for why freedom policies work in a variety of issues, including education and tax policy, economic policy, and that sort of thing. The John Locke Foundation has done amazing work for the past 30 years. Civitas is turning 15 years old this year, so we're half your age. We're little babies. But the John Locke Foundation, to Amy's point, has done a good job of research. That hard-nosed academic research for a long time. And some people got together about 15 years ago and formed the Civitas Institute and thought that, part of what is needed in order to drive good policy dialogue in a state like North Carolina is to engage those active citizens. And so that was sort of the counterpoint of Civitas to the John Locke Foundation, so that we could complement each other. And that's actually in our name. The Civitas Institute is a free market think tank in North Carolina that fights barriers to freedom so that all North Carolinians can live the life that they want. But our primary audience are the citizens themselves. Civitas is Latin for the body politic of people that, in Roman times in Latin would make up the Roman Republic. It would make up our republic here in North Carolina. And so that's our primary audience. We write about a variety of issues, but our staff would say that we write about the 3 E's, which would be economics, education, and elections policy. And you can see these notebooks behind me here. We also do a lot of public opinion polling. We do 8 to 10 statewide polls a year and some other flash polls throughout the year, but we try to keep sort of our finger on the pulse of what people think in North Carolina. And we've been doing that since 2005. And actually, our next poll will be released on August 13th, and we'll be doing this virtually, and it'll be Amy Cooke, who will be our guest commentator. And so we look forward to that.
That here on North Carolina. But what about the national scene? One of the premier writers and analysts who does that for us, keeps his eye on the national scene, is our panelist today, Andy McCarthy. Andy is a former federal prosecutor. He is a senior fellow at National Review Institute. You also see him on Fox News as an analyst and commentator, and you can read his work. And it's just an incredible body of work that Andy is responsible for. He's also an author, including his latest book, Ball of Collusion. If you haven't read that or bought that book, please do so. It is really amazing. Andy, we are so glad to be along with you today. Andy, we're seeing all of this violence, vandalism. We're seeing it in Portland, Minneapolis, other cities. You got police cars surrounded. You've got police officers attacked, federal troops deployed to a major city. And North Carolina not immune to this whole thing. We've seen our share of unrest and some violence as well. We've had looting and vandalism in downtown Raleigh. We've seen some of this in Durham, protesters blocking people from making their way on a major freeway in the triangle here. In Raleigh, we also saw a protester actually jump on the hood of a woman's car while she was in the driver's seat. All of that captured on video. Andy, what in the world is going on with our country?
Boy, I wish there was a short answer to that. But before I give it, let me just say how pleased I am to be today with you all. It's an honor to be back with John Locke Society, and also to be with Civitas today. Very much appreciate the opportunity to address these things, and very much appreciate the work that you do. Because the principles that we've been talking about just for the last few minutes are under assault like they haven't been probably for almost half a century. I think the one good thing that you could say about that, if you're going to reach for a silver lining, is that we have been through this before. And it's in the historical memory, at least of, old fogies like me. But I grew up in the Bronx in the 1960s and 70s, which was a time of high crime. And it also turns out, I know this is out of the historical memory of a lot of people, but it was a time of a lot of domestic terrorism in the United States. I reviewed a book for National Review not long ago, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, by a fellow by the name of Brian Burroughs, called Days of Rage, which was a history of terrorism in the United States from the late 1960s into the early 1980s. And it's kind of a forgotten era because we've had really a generation of domestic tranquility beginning in the early 1990s up until very recently. But for example, this is always an eye-opener for people. In 1972 alone, just that year, there were 1,900 bombings in the United States. 1,900. Now, when you hear that, we're not talking about bombings like the World Trade Center attack, either one, or the kinds of, terrorist bombings where you had organizations that were projecting power on the level of a nation state. But we did have a very steady stream of domestic terrorism. We did have hard left and anarchist organizations, Black separatist organizations, all working together against not only the federal government, but the governments of the states and the municipalities. So this is not something we haven't seen before. I don't want to, eventually we come out of it, and we came out of it strongly. I think there's a lot of things to be worried about in connection with this current era of it compared to that time, because, back in the 1960s, 70s, even into the 80s, I think the institutions, particularly the academy, were stronger than they are now. We're now having to deal with this under circumstances where we've turned the institutions of opinion and education in our country over to the left for the last 3 generations. And a lot of that is the reason, the rationale for what we're seeing today. But I think basically what's going on right now is you have a strong cultural movement that's anti-American and that is organized around a lot of what we would regard as irrational principles. But what I learned prosecuting terrorists who also have a kind of an ideology that's fundamentalist and on fire is that something always beats nothing, particularly when you're dealing with young people. And on one side of the equation here, I think you have a very strong ideological movement that is crazy, but it knows what it believes, and it's rabidly anti-American. And on the other side of the coin, I think it's sometimes we're not sure we deserve to survive. We're not as proud as we used to be as a country of who we are, what we stand for, and what our principles are. And what I worry about is that you have something, as noxious as it is, fighting against people who aren't sure that they're worth saving. And I think until we reach back into that spring well and realize what's great about America and why America is so essential, why America has been like God's gift to the world, we're going to have a problem. And I don't know that you turn that around in a day or on a dime, but it's got to be turned around.
Andy, in addition to the violence that we're seeing, things that are well beyond protests, which all of us here understand that peaceful protesting is part of America. We're talking about something well beyond that. In addition, though, you have cancel culture. So it seems like there is an attack on basic freedoms, so that if you are not politically correct, that people want to shut down your speech, shut down your ability to move about, shut down your ability to live a peaceful life. So is this about the rule of law? Is it about anti-Americanism, as you mentioned, or what does this mean for us? If we restore the rule of law, do we take care of all this?
No, I think, law is very limited in what it can do to fix a society. And it's even limited in what it can do in terms of keeping order. If you think about it, back in May into June, right after George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis, the big argument that we were having was whether the president had the authority to dispatch troops into some of these cities that were in upheaval. And the reason that became a serious discussion is because I think having had 30 years of record low crime, economic flourishing, domestic tranquility, what people forget is that that took a long time to build and to put into place. And what it creates over time is the presumption of the rule of law, the presumption that the law will be enforced. The police are, as long as you have that in place, police, law enforcement, prosecutors, and the like can keep that in place for a long time. But if it's lost, they're not capable of establishing it on their own. It's just, we don't have enough police and the array of people who are involved in keeping law and order. We don't have enough of that you can establish what you need in the first place in order to have the rule of law, which is stability and order. And I think that just goes to show that even in the context of law and order, there are severe limitations to what law enforcement can provide, and certainly that federal law enforcement can provide. I often point out to people that, in New York City alone, we have 38,000 cops who patrol that geographically small, but by population very large city. There are only 13,000 FBI agents in the whole country, and most of them don't work on violent crime matters. They have, federal programs that they deal with. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I think law enforcement is at the end of the string. And we always think of everything as being downhill or downstream from culture. I think politics is more important than law, but culture is much more important than politics. And part of the problem that we have, which is showing itself to be an enormous problem right now, is that we've fallen into the trap of thinking things like law enforcement can address the deeper cultural problems that we have. When in point of fact, when things get as intense as they are now, law enforcement can't even do the job that we expect it to do.
Amy, it just saddens me so much to even think and have to really seriously consider Andy's reference that there are people in this country who really may not think we're worth saving, or don't think that the way that our society functions in this country and the way we were founded and the principles on which we were founded are really worth saving. I mean, that's like a dagger in my heart.
Yeah, that struck me as well, that there are people in this country who feel like the United States is not worth saving. The country, the constitutional republic that for over 200 years, people have wanted to come here. And there's a reason. It's because freedom isn't, to be French doesn't, you're supposed to, I guess, have DNA or something. To be an American is to believe an idea of freedom, is to believe in the principles of freedom. But to Ronald Reagan's famous quote, it has to be taught with every single generation. And right now, what we're seeing to me is the manifestation of not having taught that, of people who don't feel like that this nation is worth protecting, and they're championing something that killed 100 million people. I mean, the disconnect for folks like us is enormous. Just so folks know, my backdrop here, and I use this all the time, this was from a few weeks ago when I went down, I went to Charlotte, and this is what greeted me at a Marriott hotel. This is not, this is that them protecting themselves from violence. This is not.
It's boarded up there,
yeah,
right?
If everybody, I mean, you walk it, there was a little tiny door you could go into, and the only way you got in was to be let in. And this is the Queen City. This is the banking capital. This is a premier city in the United States. And this is what we are doing to protect private property, is boarding it up. And to Amy's point, why? Because we're at a point now where law enforcement, to some extent, can't even do its job. You know, and with that, you've got calls to abolish law enforcement, defund police. And if we lose, as somebody who is married to a career law enforcement official, I always say to people, listen, I said, when my husband walked out the door, he left my house, he was getting between a bad guy and your family, not my family, because he wasn't with me. He was willing to take a bullet for you, not me, for you at that point. And that thin blue line is really thin, and it is fraying in some cases. And we should be very, very afraid of if that thin blue line breaks. Did somebody ask, what can we do about this? I'm telling you, we have to be fearless in our defense of freedom. They are counting on us cowering for defending our principles. So we absolutely have to be fearless in the face of this, because make no mistake, we are under attack.
Donald, how do we explain to people that this is an opportunity society, and if they don't like this society, they the choices down from America and our founding principles are really, really, really bad, much, much worse than anything that happens in this country. So how have we, I don't know, have we failed in the freedom movement here to explain opportunity and what that means?
Well, I think there is a problem with civics education, just at its fundamental level of, you know, what is the role of government? Well, from a free market, libertarian, conservative, classical liberal, any of those point of view, the role of government is simply to protect rights, right? That's the point. The point of government, as it was created under the North Carolina Constitution originally, when John Locke helped write that, up until the actual framers of the United States Constitution, were there was this concept of positive and negative rights. And so the problem is that a lot of people believe that the government bestows rights upon people, and they feel like if those rights have been violated in some way, then they have to, in fact, somehow grow the size of government. The only way to do that, apparently, over the past few weeks, is to do it in a sort of violent manner and to force the government's hand and to sort of fiat what they perceive as new rights to be put into law. And that's not how it should have been done. It's not how it's ever been done, except very rarely in history, like the case of the American Revolution. But even in the case of the American Revolution, I mean, you had things like the Olive Branch petition that went to King George, and there was a back and forth dialogue between the king, and when the king finally stopped talking is when we went into a state of independence. I don't think we're at a place where we're at a revolution here in the United States, but I think that people just don't understand the purpose of the rule of law, or have never even thought of the term rule of law. I found a really good quote from Calvin Coolidge, and everybody loves Calvin Coolidge, right? It says that the prime element in the value of any property is the knowledge that its peaceful enjoyment will be publicly defended. And he's talking about property rights there, and there's been a breakdown of property rights overall from government, and that they aren't protecting them at all. We're letting rioters go in the street, and then people aren't being prosecuted. We're asking for police to stand down and not actually, stop people from breaking property. But then he also gets to a more basic element in there, in that the rule of law needs to be equally applied, and it's not being equally applied, and that's why. One, there's a part of society, and it's a minority, but there's a part of society that feels like they've been infringed upon. And then from a conservative or free market point of view, we're not standing up and trying to talk about it.
But isn't there a way for us to be able, as a society, to come together to address very serious and real situations of inequality and certainly of cops that have gone well outside the law. Like we saw it with George Floyd. I mean, everyone's heart just absolutely breaks. That was shocking to see what happened to him. But can't we address those situations without kind of throwing out freedom and throwing out America at the same time? Or how did these two things seem to come together to be, you're either for America and doing something about a cop that is bad, or you're not?
Yes, we can, and we absolutely should, and we should be forceful and unapologetic about wanting it, being in favor of freedom and being in favor of individual freedom, and freedom actually being the answer to all this. And I know Mr. McCarthy can probably answer this a lot more eloquently than I can. But I think that, it is illegal for police to asphyxiate someone. That's illegal now. We don't need new laws to fix that sort of thing. And while that is illegal, I think that there's a perception among a segment of the population that believe that, for whatever reason, white police officers are getting away literally with murder. And in some cases that's true, but that's not because there's anything that's not inherent to any whiteness, or it's not inherent to anything to do with, the tenets of freedom in American society. It has more to do with the fact that due to just candidly the way that police unions have sort of a stranglehold over how officers are disciplined, that the law hasn't been applied equally. And in that case, I think that we should step up and talk about the rule of law has to be applied equally, and it should be applied equally. And that's a whole nother conversation about public sector unions. And I think that as the freedom movement goes forward, we can sort of lean into that. When we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm not going to talk about the Marxist organization itself, but the movement itself, there's a lot of trepidation and a lot of distrust of government at its heart because they fear the power of government. Well, so do conservatives and libertarians. And so I think there's an opportunity to talk about that, and we should do that and lean into that conversation rather than shy away from it.
So Andy, you have written and talked a bit about another component of a kind of rule of law, and that is this movement that has been fielding progressive candidates for district attorney, many of them getting elected, et cetera, because they play a key role in the criminal justice system. Talk a little bit, if you would, about what is happening across the country with these leftist DAs.
Well, I think that this thematically goes to what we were just talking about. Part of the big problem that I think we have is that we don't have a consensus about what we mean by what good government is, and we don't have a consensus about what we mean about what freedom is, and how freedom and equality are actually, unless you have a consensus of what they mean, they're in eternal tension. And the reason that that's important is because while our idea of government, good government, is one that, as Donald says, protects rights, that's what it exists to do, we have a very strong movement which has a lot more of a following in the country than I think that we often like to realize, that sees government as a tool to address what it perceives as structural inequalities in the society. And it sees governance as basically a power that you can have at your disposal in order to make social change, rather than government being something that reflects the values of the governed and actually operates legitimately with the consent of the governed. And one of the ways that this has manifested itself in the conflicts in our society is when you have a vast administrative state and things get very complex and sprawling in government, what you often find, you think your rights are protected, but if you have to be in court in order to validate them, the process actually becomes a penalty in and of itself. I mean, you may sue, and ultimately, if you think about these people in St. Louis, for example, who were protecting their home by brandishing weapons when you had people coming by and trespassing, they'll probably be fine in the end. We'll get to the end of the rainbow and their Second Amendment rights will be upheld, but not until they've gone through now a criminal procedure where they have to hire counsel, and they have to hope that the state attorney general is able to litigate successfully against the local district attorney, and as a backstop that the governor will pardon them if all else fails. So they're going to go through a lot of expense and a lot of time and a lot of misery in order to validate rights that they're not supposed to have to go to court to validate. The whole reason that government is supposed to exist is to prevent that from happening. It's to protect us in the exercise of our rights. So what this means is that the other side, in advancing its agenda, has realized that if it controls the government, it controls the processes that can be used in a very punitive way, and ultimately over time erodes our rights because people just get tired out and exhausted by trying to defend themselves. And probably the apogee of this movement is this new, what I call the progressive prosecutor project. And what this is about is you have very lucrative, extensive fundraising mechanisms on the left. And one of the things they realized was that district attorneys, the chief prosecutor in every different district or county in the country, have lots and lots of power. In many ways, they have more power than legislatures because it's one thing to write the laws. If you're the pointy end of the spear, if you're the one who's applying the laws, you have much more consequence in terms of how people live their lives day to day. And what the left realized is that in a lot of these prosecutor elections across the country, these were pretty meager contests in terms of fundraising. They were basically 5-figure races. If you raised $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, that was a lot of money in a lot of these races. So in they come, plunking down hundreds of thousands and in some places millions of dollars to back progressive candidates who are actually anti-prosecution lawyers who are looking to exploit the power of the state in order to advance the progressive agenda. And they've managed to get a number of prosecutors elected in many of the big cities across the country. Let me just talk about 2 of them quickly because each day there's something more astonishing about them. I want to talk about one, Larry Krasner, because something came up right before we got together today. He's now the district attorney of Philadelphia. He said today that if Donald Trump sends federal agents into Philadelphia to enforce the law, and by the way, federal agents are already in Philadelphia enforcing the law and have been like forever, he will prosecute them. He will have them arrested if they don't comport themselves with his standards of how the law is supposed to be enforced. If we are actually now going to get to a point where, you know, the feds are going to arrest the state agents and the state agents are going to arrest the federal agents, talk about having chaos. And then, of course, the one I wrote about recently over the weekend and have written a bit about is Chesa Boudin, who is the district attorney of San Francisco. He is the son and I guess foster son of Weather Underground terrorists. His parents, when he was 20 months old, left him off with a sitter so that they could go off with the Black Liberation Army and as Weather Underground terrorists and carry out the infamous 1981 Brinks robbery in which 2 police officers and a security guard were killed. They got very lengthy sentences, the 2 parents. So he was raised by 2 other Weather Underground terrorists who were more notorious, I think, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. And he is a star in left-wing politics. Graduated from Oxford, graduated from Yale, and was elected on a platform that was supported by the celebrity communist professor Angela Davis, Bernie Sanders, all of the left-wing superstars. And basically he ran on a platform of being against the police and the idea that he would use his power to investigate police officers and do what he could to block Trump from enforcing the immigration laws in San Francisco. Those were his two big agenda items. So, you know, in sum, what you're seeing is very powerful officials who are progressive ideologues who see the government's power not as something to protect people's rights, but to advance an ideological agenda.
Well, it's certainly an argument, I think, for all of us to remember that if you want to be an informed citizen and an informed voter, pay attention to races, not just at the top of the ballot or even halfway down the ballot, but you've really got to be informed about those local candidates, whether it's school board, district attorney, or whatever. You've really got to take an interest in that. And of course, here at the John Locke Foundation, we're really focusing on races through our reporting of Carolina Journal. And so we've got folks who are interested in doing that. And I want to remind our guests here as well, we are going to take some questions. If you have one, please do type it into the chat function here for the webinar, and we will see if we can get to some of those. Let's talk a little bit about moving forward and what we can do. Am I naive to think that if the economy gets back on its feet, we have perhaps the vaccine comes at the end of the year and things start to move back at least towards normal and that economic renaissance that we talked about here in North Carolina? Is it naive to think that if people feel more secure in their jobs, they're back to work, they're earning a living, their kids are back in school, that some of this unrest will go away? Or is that Pollyannish? Have we kind of, jumped the shark on all this?
Donna, good question. And one thing that you said, and I just want to comment on that, and then I'll talk about that question a little bit, sort of how do we move forward from here? And can we get back to stability? One of the things, you would think that as a society, we could have conversations. We're only talking about degrees of public policy, right? But Andy brought up something about this progressive prosecutor sort of movement. And we saw that when I was back in Colorado. They're pouring millions of dollars into some of these local races or into a state legislative race or something like that. We would be naive to think that if all of this unrest goes away, that they are suddenly, okay, well, I know I've invested millions, so we'll just keep everything as it is. These are people who want, as Barack Obama said it, fundamentally transform America, and that's what they are actually looking to do. So. Naive, Pollyanna-ish, I guess. To some extent, I want to say, yes, I mean, certainly you won't have the angst. If people are back at work, if the unemployment rate drops, if we have a vaccine, there won't be that uncertainty. But right now, with people unemployed, they have the ability to go out and riot and loot and burn and do everything else. They're thriving off of that uncertainty. And to some folks, they've invested a whole lot of money in this. So I don't think it's going to be as simple as we'll get back to, the economy will get better, and so everything is going to it'll die down. I think we hope that, but I think there's the opposition to the rule of law, to the United States as a whole, to America, to our greatness. The opposition to it sees this as a moment. I'm not certain they're going to let that go. I could be wrong, and the other panelists may have a different idea, but I don't see them letting that go lightly because they've invested a lot of time and a lot of their money into it.
Other thoughts on that issue, Donald or Andy?
Yeah, I would just say that I think we're in for this at least through Election Day.
Yeah, for sure.
For those who saw this as a political strategy, I mean, if you think about where we were just in February, which is the blink of an eye ago, it actually looked like the economy was so good that Trump might actually be cruising toward re-election. Now he's significantly behind. And if you're, at least if the polls are to be believed, and I think there's enough of a gap that you have to take it seriously. If you're a political strategist and you're looking at this as objectively as you can, I think you have to say the strategy has worked pretty well for them. And if there's a feeling that the country is unstable and that chaos reigns, and that we're still dealing with the virus, we still have mayhem in the streets, that can't be good for the incumbent. So, I think they look at this as a political strategy, and I expect it to continue for the next 3 months.
And, to the point of how people are feeling about this, Donald, I know you folks at the Civitas Institute, polling is one of the important things that you do. And you asked the question about right track, wrong track, etc. And I know we're going to be having a new poll that's going to be coming out fairly soon. I wanted to bring up a point that was just released today, a new poll from folks over at High Point University. And this is of North Carolina registered voters, plus 6.2% margin of error. But they asked the question about right direction and wrong track in North Carolina. 77% saying wrong track. The country is on the wrong track. Only 15% said right direction. So it's hard to interpret, what do people mean? What do the 77% think is wrong? But that is a huge indicator of unrest, at least in my view. What do you think, Donald? You're a seasoned pollster.
Thank you. That's sweet. What we've been seeing, we asked that question, we asked those two questions, right track, wrong track, for North Carolina and the nation every time we do a poll. That's a little higher on wrong track than what we've seen nationally, but what we've seen over the past 6-7 months in North Carolina is a flip in that for the past 8 years or so, people have been generally pessimistic about both the nation and the state, and we can talk about for a variety of reasons why that's the case. But then over the past 6 or 7 months, that has sort of changed where they are still pessimistic about the nation. And I'm sure Democrats are pessimistic about the White House, and Republicans are probably pessimistic about Congress. And we can talk about that. But then people are very optimistic about North Carolina specifically. And I think that has a lot to do with sort of the decade of change that we've seen in North Carolina over the past few years. I'm curious to see how all of this social unrest will play out in our next poll. I'm concerned that wrong direction is so high in the High Point poll. But I do want to bring up one point about a poll that came out within the past week from The Economist and YouGov partnered together. And a lot of this unrest that we have circles around how people feel about the police. But when 1,500 U.S. adult citizens were asked the question, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of police officers in your community? 65% total favorability for police officers in their community, 26% total unfavorable. And when you get into the crosstabs on that, the only crosstab or the only demographic that has a net unfavorable opinion of police in their community are African Americans, with 36% favorability and 44% unfavorability. And now that's not to target African Americans or talk about that. I think that has a lot to do with perception of police that the media perpetuates about how police have treated African Americans across the country. And that's not just because people have that opinion doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It is a problem of perception. But I do want to get across the point that overall, two-thirds of U.S. citizens that were polled have a favorable view of their police officers in their community.
And Donna, can I bring up something on that?
Sure.
There's a question here. What can we do about the role of the media in fomenting all this violence and instability? And it goes back to what Donald just brought up in that poll. And actually, when I wrote a column about sort of tread lightly on police reform, mostly because what is being used, the narrative that is being used to sort of advocate or promote this, police reform. And I'm not saying all of it is bad, like with public sector unions, get rid of them for sure. When it comes to law enforcement, those are the ones that are protecting, public sector unions are protecting bad apples a lot of times. But it's this perception that white law enforcement officers are hunting down African Americans and killing them, and we've heard it perpetuated time and time and again. And actually, what prompted me to write that column, one of them was an article that appeared in National Review just saying, listen, these numbers that the media will just throw out, I know this is going to shock a lot of people, being taken out of context and not actually being looked at properly. So one of the things that we can do and should be doing is making sure that anytime the media throws out some statistic, that it's being analyzed, reviewed, looked at properly. Because in the case of law enforcement, it's not. And they're using that to say we should defund police, we should abolish police, we should get rid of the police, bring in social workers, just the most absurd types of policy suggestions, all under the name of reform, something that won't keep us safe whatsoever. And I love the fact that there is a poll that says people actually do like law enforcement in their communities, because I got to tell you, the communities that will be hurt the most are those marginalized communities and low income, where they are the most victimized. If we were to go through with defunding or abolishing the police based on a narrative that isn't even accurate. And thanks for National Review for writing one of the first columns that said, listen, you guys are not looking at this properly.
Yeah, if I could just, I know we're running short on time, but I just want to pile on top of Amy's point. The Chris Wallace interviewed the president over the weekend, and I point to it because millions and millions of people watch that. And he's a very, very fine reporter. I happen to know him. He's a great guy, very careful about trying to get it right. But, he asked President, setting up a question, he asked the president flat out, now look, if you are twice as likely to be killed by the police if you are black than white in America. And it struck at me because I've looked at this like a million times. That's exactly the opposite of the truth. If you look at it in terms of absolute numbers, twice as many white people are killed than black people in police encounters. It's not just like he's a little wrong. It's like 180 degrees different from what he said. Yet that is one of the building blocks of the narrative. Now, how do they get to twice as many? They have to do a bunch of statistical voodoo about the percentage of, blacks and black men in the population versus the white population. If you're going to take other factors in to weight your formula, why is percentage of the population the one? Why wouldn't you think about, like, for example, offense behavior, which would seem to me to be more relevant if you're going to talk about police encounters than, something as raw as, just percentage in the population. But whatever you think of how that's weighted, the fact of the matter is they say, and this gets repeated so many times that people think it's true, that black people are twice as likely to be killed by police officers as white people, or be killed in police encounters. And it becomes a building block of a narrative on which the conclusion becomes that police officers who historically today are more representative of what their neighborhoods look like than they have ever been. But you nevertheless have this Manichaean fictional narrative that says, basically police officers are the militia of the white racist society, and what they generally do 24/7 is they're at war trying to hunt down black men and kill them. And that's insane. But if you repeat something that's insane enough times, there's a certain percentage of people who believe it. And I think it's a regrettably high percentage.
And they also, this narrative that police brutality is on the rise is also not true. Use of force has dropped dramatically. In fact, death at the hands of shooting deaths at the hands of police officers have dropped dramatically, and so has use of force. And in places, and Andy will know this well, like New York City, where if you compare it back to don't even have to go back to the 70s, go back to the 90s and take that data from the 90s to today. and you will see an incredible decrease in use of force. At the same time, we see an incredible decrease in violent crime. Yet now we have law enforcement that is not even allowed to respond in the face of real violence that I haven't seen in, we as a country haven't seen since back to the 70s and 80s.
Andy, I know that we're going to be losing you in just a couple minutes because, folks, he's going to do a Fox interview. But Andy, you had mentioned early on in our conversation about the issue of the academy and how people perceive our country and what people do and don't know about our founding. We've had several questions from our guests here today about that issue. What do we do about the academy? Is it possible, as one person put it, to establish a beachhead of classical liberalism in the academy?
Yeah, this is a long conversation, but I actually think that the model of the four-year university has to be blown up. I don't think that there's any chance that we're ever going to that freedom is going to take the campus back and that American ideals are going to I think it's too far gone, but it's also a bad deal. Economically, it's a bad deal. And even though we're in the last months where we've had to deal with this virtual learning and computer learning rather than classroom learning, there's a lot of downside to that. I think ultimately that's the future. And in terms of people who care about liberty and care about freedom and care about classical education, that's a good thing for us rather than a bad thing.
Yeah, I wonder about K-12 education in addition to the academy itself, because we just seem to have a lot of people who don't understand the brilliance of the ideas and how that there really is a reason that people from around the world are, in some cases, literally dying to try to get here. And I don't think we appreciate that enough. Sometimes it takes, at least for me, the reminder is to hear someone who is an immigrant talk about what life was like in the country they came from, why they came here, and why they love it so much. Or talk to someone, frankly, who grew up like me. I grew up poor. My father had an 8th grade education. We ended up in Arizona because my parents were migrant farm workers and they followed the crops. So that's why I was born in Arizona. It means that people of that economic status were able to have a happy and productive life in this country, and to raise a daughter, raise 4 kids, but to raise one who now is sitting as a vice president of a think tank in North Carolina. I mean, that's such an incredible story for this country, and people don't seem to appreciate it, and that always bothers me. Andy, this has been such a treat. We've got comments in the chat box here about how people have enjoyed hearing from you, as well as Amy and Donald. But Andy, it's just been terrific. I would encourage everyone to make sure you read a piece that Andy wrote a couple days ago for National Review. The headline is "The Revolution is Winning," and he will take you through some of that history that's so important and leading up to what is happening in our country today. Andy, thank you so much. I hope we can get back together with you again. Really appreciate it. We'll be watching you on Fox and reading you in National Review.
Well, thanks so much. And I hope we get to do it in person soon, but this has been a real pleasure to do. And thanks very much for the opportunity.
You are very welcome. And Amy Cooke and Donald Bryson, thank you as well. And of course, the John Locke Foundation and the Civitas Institute. We are the leaders in North Carolina's freedom movement. So to all of you who have joined us today, we can't thank you enough. We are so appreciative that you are committed to freedom, to liberty, to supporting our organizations, to standing up and defending our principles when they are under fierce attack. And that is so important. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for investing in our organizations, because we can't operate without you. We hope to do more of this again, and so stay tuned, watch your email for more collaborations and the work of both the Civitas Institute and the John Locke Foundation. And to our friends at National Review Institute, to Lindsay and Miranda and Francisco, thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this collaboration. It has been a real treat, and we have enjoyed it. Everybody have a wonderful rest of the week. And remember, freedom and this country, we are here, we are enjoying so many things that people around the world would love to have the opportunity to share in. There's a reason that people want to come here, and we have to make sure that we remember that and we share America's story. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.